The human body begins to shut down at an internal temperature of 95 degrees. For Anna Jenkins, trapped in an abandoned North Dakota freight yard, as an unprecedented -40-degree polar vortex descended, survival didn't come from a heated cabin or a rescue team. It came from a discarded wooden crate. It was the second week of January, and the sky above the desolate stretch of Highway 85 inches western North Dakota was a bruised, lifeless purple. Anna Jenkins, 32, was not supposed to be out here. A pragmatic accountant from Minneapolis, she had always relied on careful planning and calculated risks. But an urgent, garbled voicemail from her estranged father, Arthur, hospitalized and fading fast in a rural clinic near Williston, had sent her packing her 2011 Subaru Outback in the middle of the night. She hadn't waited for the morning weather advisories. She hadn't heard local meteorologist Gregory Finch frantically warning residents of a freak atmospheric anomaly creeping down from the Arctic Circle. They were calling it a century storm. It wasn't just snow. It was a catastrophic plunge in temperature, a wall of lethal, localized cold capable of freezing exposed skin in less than 3 minutes. 80 miles outside of Williston, the Subaru's dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The alternator, struggling against the already bitter cold, let out a high-pitched whine and died. Minutes later, the engine sputtered and choked into silence. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Anna sat in the driver's seat, watching her own breath plume into the rapidly chilling air. She tried her phone. No signal. She was in a dead zone, flanked by miles of frozen, empty plains and skeletal winter trees. She knew the rule of winter survival: stay with the vehicle. But as the interior temperature of the car plummeted from a comfortable 70 degrees to freezing in less than 20 minutes, a deep, primal panic began to set in. The wind began to howl, a low, mechanical scream that violently rocked the Subaru. Through the frosted windshield, she saw the storm front approaching a solid, white wall, obliterating the horizon. Waiting in a metal box that was rapidly becoming a freezer was a death sentence. She recalled passing a chain-link fence and a cluster of low-slung buildings about a mile back. It looked like an old industrial site, a relic of the early 2010s oil boom. Gathering her emergency supplies, a thin fleece blanket, a half-empty bottle of water, a flashlight, and a small Swiss Army knife, she zipped her parka to her chin and pushed the door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. The ambient temperature had already dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that made it feel like -40. Every step back down the icy shoulder of the highway was an agonizing battle. Her eyelashes froze together. The moisture inside her nose turned to sharp, tiny crystals. Her heavy snow boots felt like blocks of lead. After 40 minutes of grueling, blinding exertion, she reached the rusted gates of Caldwell and Sons Heavy Freight. The padlock had long since been broken, hanging uselessly from the chain. Anna pushed through, seeking the immediate sanctuary of the largest structure on the lot, a massive, corrugated steel warehouse. She managed to pry open a side door whose hinges had rusted through. She threw herself inside and slammed the door shut, cutting off the deafening roar of the wind. She collapsed onto the concrete floor, gasping for air, her lungs burning with the raw cold. But as her breathing slowed, the grim reality of her sanctuary became apparent. The warehouse was cavernous, drafty, and entirely made of steel and concrete. It offered protection from the wind, but absolutely zero insulation. In fact, the massive steel walls acted like a deep freeze, drawing the cold inward. Within hours, the temperature inside this building would match the lethal temperature outside. If she fell asleep on this concrete floor, she would never wake up. Desperation fueled a frantic search of the pitch-black interior. Her flashlight beam swept across empty pallets, rusted chains, and discarded oil drum. Then, pushed into a far corner beneath a collapsed mezzanine, she saw it. It was a heavy-duty industrial shipping crate. It measured roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high. Constructed from thick, 1-inch marine-grade plywood and reinforced with steel brackets, it had likely been used to transport delicate, high-value drilling machinery. Anna stared at the box. It looked uncomfortably like a coffin, but to a mind rapidly calculating the physics of thermal dynamics, it looked like a microclimate. She couldn't heat a 50,000 square foot steel warehouse. but she just might be able to heat 20 cubic feet of space using nothing but her own body. Her fingers were growing clumsy, the first dangerous stages of frostnip setting in. She knew she had less than an hour of functional mobility left before the deep cold robbed her of her motor skills entirely. She had to build her sanctuary, and she had to do it now. Anna approached the heavy wooden crate. One of the reinforced side panels was partially unbolted, hanging loose on a single heavy hinge. She grabbed the edge and pulled. The rusty hinge shrieked in the echoing warehouse, but the panel gave way, creating a narrow entrance. She crawled inside. It smelled of ancient pine, dust, and faint, metallic machine oil. The darkness was absolute, but the immediate cessation of the ambient drafts was a profound relief. However, an empty wooden box was not enough to survive -40 degrees. The wood provided a windbreak and some thermal mass, but she needed insulation to trap the 98.6 degrees of heat her body was desperately trying to generate. She scrambled back out into the freezing warehouse. Time was slipping away. Her core temperature was dropping, and her thoughts were becoming sluggish, a terrifying symptom of hypothermia. She forced herself to methodically scour the debris scattered around the warehouse floor. Near the collapsed mezzanine, she struck gold. A torn, moldy canvas tarp lay crumpled beneath a rusted forklift. Beside it was a half-crushed cardboard box overflowing with industrial packing materials, thick, recycled denim insulation pads used to protect heavy equipment from impact, and sheets of heavy-duty bubble wrap. It was trash, left behind by Caldwell & Sons a decade ago, but to Anna, it was more valuable than spun gold. Working with frantic, clumsy urgency, she dragged the tarp and the packing materials back to her crate. Her hands were shaking violently now, her body convulsing in uncontrollable shivers. This was good, she reminded herself. Shivering meant her body was still fighting. When the shivering stopped, she was dead. She lined the bottom of the crate with the thick cardboard, creating a crucial barrier between herself and the freezing concrete floor that the crate rested upon. Next, she layered the denim insulation pads over the cardboard, creating a makeshift mattress. She used the bubble wrap to line the wooden walls, pressing the plastic into the corners to seal off any microscopic drafts where the plywood sheets met. Finally, she dragged the heavy canvas tarp inside. She positioned herself in the center of the crate, pulled the unbolted wooden panel shut behind her, and jammed a heavy piece of scrap wood against it from the inside to keep it sealed. The darkness was suffocating. The silence, broken only by her own ragged, chattering breath, was deafening. She wrapped the canvas tarp completely around her body, cocooning herself alongside her thin fleece blanket. Now, the waiting began. The psychological battle was about to eclipse the physical one. For the first few hours, it felt like a losing game. The cold radiating from the wood was intense. She curled into a tight fetal position, pulling her knees to her chest to minimize her surface area. The air inside the crate was freezing, and every breath she exhaled felt like a waste of precious heat. She buried her face inside the collar of her parka, forcing herself to rebreathe her own warm exhalations. She thought of her father, Arthur, lying in a hospital bed 40 miles away. She thought of her older brother, David, sitting in a warm house in Seattle, completely unaware that his sister was slowly freezing to death in a forgotten industrial graveyard. The urge to close her eyes, to let the exhaustion wash over her and surrender to the creeping, painless sleep of severe hypothermia, was incredibly seductive. "Stay awake," she ordered herself. "Do not sleep." To keep her mind active, she began to do complex mathematical equations in her head. She recited the lyrics to every song she could remember. She moved her toes and fingers constantly, maintaining circulation. Around 3 a.m., something miraculous began to happen. The violent shivering slowly began to subside, not because she was dying, but because the microclimate was working. The heavy marine plywood, the bubble wrap, the thick denim pads, and the heavy canvas tarp were finally doing their job. They had trapped the heat radiating from her body. The interior of the crate, while still bitterly cold, had stabilized. It was no longer -40 degrees in the box. It was hovering somewhere around 35 degrees, just above freezing. It was miserable, bone-chilling, and deeply uncomfortable, but it was survivable. But as dawn broke, unseen by Anna in her dark wooden tomb, a new terror emerged. The wind outside had shifted, intensifying into a sheer, howling gale. The massive warehouse began to groan and shriek under the pressure. Then, Anna heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a deep, structural snapping sound, followed by the terrifying crash of metal twisting and tearing. The roof of the aging warehouse, unable to withstand the sheer weight of the sudden, massive snowdrift and the relentless wind, was beginning to collapse. A massive beam slammed into the concrete floor just yards away from her crate, sending a shockwave through the wood that rattled her teeth. Dust and frozen debris rained down on the top of her wooden sanctuary. She was safe from the cold for now, but the very building she had sought refuge in was tearing itself apart, threatening to crush her wooden crate and her into dust. The shriek of tearing corrugated steel was deafening, a violent metallic scream that seemed to rip the very air apart. Inside her pitch-black wooden cocoon, Anna Jenkins braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut and curling her body as tightly as humanly possible. A thunderous impact shook the concrete floor. The vibrations traveled up through the bottom of the marine-grade plywood crate, rattling Anna's bones and sending a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into her exhausted heart. Dust, decades old and tasting of rust and dried earth, billowed through the microscopic gaps in the crate's construction, filling her confined space with a choking cloud. She coughed, a dry, hacking sound that immediately cost her precious body heat. Then came the secondary collapse. It sounded like a freight train derailing directly overhead. A massive, unimaginable weight slammed into the top of the wooden shipping crate. The thick, 1-inch plywood groaned in protest, bowing inward under the immense pressure, but the heavy steel brackets reinforcing the corners held fast. The crate did not shatter, it held. But the silence that followed the crash was infinitely more terrifying than the noise. The low, howling draft that had been whistling through the cavernous warehouse was gone. The ambient sounds of the wind battering the exterior steel walls were muted, muffled beneath tons of collapsed roofing, snow, and twisted metal joists. Anna waited for her racing heartbeat to slow, the thumping in her ears drowning out all other sounds. When she finally opened her eyes, the darkness was absolute. It possessed a physical weight, pressing against her face. Panic, sharp and metallic, clawed at her throat. She pushed away the heavy canvas tarp and reached out with a trembling, numb, gloved hand. She felt the denim insulation, the bubble wrap, and the cold, unyielding wood of the door panel she had pulled shut hours ago. She pressed her shoulder against the panel and pushed. It didn't move. She adjusted her footing, bracing her boots against the opposite end of the 6-foot crate, and shoved with all her remaining strength. The wood creaked, but the panel remained firmly locked in place. The reality of her situation settled over her like a suffocating shroud. The falling debris had not crushed her, but it had trapped her. A steel beam, a slab of concrete, or perhaps just thousands of pounds of snow and rusted roofing, now lay directly against the entrance of the crate. She was entombed. The immediate threat of freezing to death had been temporarily mitigated by the microclimate she had built, but a new, equally lethal adversary now entered the psychological battlefield. Claustrophobia. The walls felt as though they were shrinking. Her breathing hitched, becoming shallow and rapid. "You are going to suffocate," her mind screamed. "You are buried alive in a wooden box." "Stop," Anna rasped out loud, her voice cracking in the dry, freezing air. "Think. Just think." She forced herself to analyze the facts, grounding her spiraling emotions in hard reality. The crate was not airtight. If it were, she would have suffocated hours ago. The dust that had blown in during the collapse proved there was airflow, however minimal. Carbon dioxide buildup was a risk, but not an immediate one. She had oxygen. She had a thermal barrier. What she did not have was water. Dehydration in sub-zero temperatures is a silent killer. The human body expends a massive amount of moisture just to humidify the freezing air it breathes in. Anna reached for the half-empty plastic water bottle she had brought from the Subaru. Her thick gloves fumbled with the plastic. It was rock hard. The water inside had frozen completely solid. Despair threatened to overwhelm her again. She unscrewed the cap, pulled off her right glove with her teeth, and exposed her bare skin to the 35-degree air inside the crate. Her fingers were stiff, pale, and aching with a dull, throbbing pain. She took the small Swiss Army knife from her pocket, pried open the main blade, and began to chip frantically at the ice inside the bottleneck. Tiny shards of ice flew out, hitting her face. She managed to break off a few small chunks, tipping them into her mouth. They burned her tongue with their intense cold, sending a shiver through her entire body. Melting the ice required body heat she could not afford to lose. It was a brutal, physiological trade-off. To hydrate, she had to lower her core temperature. To stay warm, she had to risk severe dehydration and kidney strain. She placed the frozen bottle against her chest, slipping it beneath her heavy parka and trapping it against her base layers. It was agonizingly cold. A block of ice against her ribs, but her core body temperature was the only furnace she had. Hours bled into one another. Time lost all meaning in the dark. She slipped into a dangerous, lethargic state between wakefulness and hypothermic unconsciousness. Hallucinations, fueled by exhaustion and dehydration, began to dance in the pitch black. She heard her father, Arthur, calling her name. She saw him sitting in the passenger seat of her Subaru, complaining about the heater. She imagined the smell of black coffee and diesel fuel from the truck stop they used to visit when she was a child. Arthur, she thought, a tear finally escaping her eye and freezing almost instantly on her cheek. I'm sorry. I tried to make it. She forced herself to move. She tapped her feet together. She flexed her fingers. She checked the water bottle. A few tablespoons of water had melted. She drank it greedily, the liquid feeling like sandpaper sliding down her raw throat. Suddenly, a sound jolted her awake. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groaning of the wood. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming, faint but distinct, transmitting through the frozen ground and up into the base of her wooden tomb. It sounded like a heavy diesel engine. 30 hours after the century storm made landfall, the sky over western North Dakota cleared, revealing a blindingly bright, utterly frozen landscape. The temperature had risen slightly to a manageable -10 degrees, but the damage was catastrophic. Highway 85 was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles, snowdrifts 10 feet high, and downed power lines. Officer Wyatt Henderson of the North Dakota Highway Patrol was exhausted. He and plow driver Pete Kowalski had been working for 18 hours straight, clearing paths for emergency vehicles and searching for stranded motorists. The heater in Wyatt's cruiser was blasting, but the chill still clung to his bones. Dispatch, this is Car 42. We're about 3 miles south of the Alexander turnoff. Nothing but drifts so far, Wyatt said into the radio, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. Copy that, 42. Dispatcher Brenda's voice crackled back, heavy with fatigue. We have an outstanding missing persons report. Anna Jenkins, 32, driving a 2011 silver Subaru Outback. Last pinged a cell tower in your vicinity roughly 28 hours ago. Family says she was headed to the Williston Clinic. Wyatt sighed, staring out at the endless expanse of white. 28 hours in, -40 wind chill. The unspoken reality hung heavy in the cruiser. They weren't looking for a survivor anymore. They were looking for a body. Keep your eyes peeled, Pete, Wyatt said into the CB radio, connecting him to the massive rotary plow ahead. 20 minutes later, Pete's voice crackled through the speaker. Wyatt, up ahead. On the shoulder. Looks like an antenna sticking out of a drift. Wyatt hit the lights and pulled his cruiser up behind the plow. Wading through waist-deep snow, they reached the mound. Wyatt used his gloved hands to brush away the top layer of powder, revealing the silver roof of a Subaru Outback. He cleared the driver's side window and peered inside, his flashlight cutting through the frost. Empty. Keys are in the ignition. Battery's dead, Wyatt yelled over the wind. He looked around. The landscape was utterly desolate. Protocol says she should have stayed with the car. If she walked out into that storm, he didn't finish the sentence. Pete pointed a thick, gloved finger toward the west. Look over there. Caldwell and Sons. Old freight yard. Maybe a mile out. If she realized the car was a freezer, she might have made a run for the buildings. It was a slim chance. A desperate gamble. But it was the only lead they had. They left the vehicles and began the grueling trek toward the chain-link fence, snowshoes keeping them above the deepest drifts. When they finally breached the gates of the freight yard, the scene was one of total devastation. The main warehouse, a massive steel structure, had completely caved in. The roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, twisting the heavy steel support beams like aluminum foil. Jesus, Pete muttered, breath pluming in the frigid air. If she went in there, Wyatt felt a heavy pit form in his stomach. They walked the perimeter of the collapsed structure. The sheer volume of twisted metal and packed snow made it impossible to see inside. Hello, Wyatt shouted, his voice swallowed instantly by the vast, open space. "North Dakota Highway Patrol. Is anyone out here?" Silence. Just the wind whistling through the torn steel. Wyatt shook his head slowly. Even if she made it inside before the storm peaked, she couldn't survive that collapse. And she certainly couldn't survive the temperatures without heat. "Let's head back, Pete. We need to call in a recovery team with heavy equipment." They turned away, taking 3 heavy steps back toward the highway. Clack, clack, clack. Wyatt froze. He held up a hand, stopping Pete in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" Pete frowned, listening intently. "Hear what? The metal settling?" They waited in breathless silence. 10 seconds passed. Then, distinctly, echoing through the hollow frozen steel wreckage, clack, 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 clack. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. "SOS," Wyatt breathed, his eyes widening. Someone is alive in there. Adrenaline flooded their systems, banishing the exhaustion. They scrambled over the mountain of snow and debris, following the acoustic resonance of the tapping. Deep beneath the wreckage, inside her wooden coffin, Anna Jenkins was striking the heavy steel bracket of the crate with the metal handle of her Swiss Army knife. She was operating on pure, primal instinct. She had heard the muffled voices, a sound so alien after 30 hours of silence that she initially thought it was another hallucination. But when the voices faded, panic had given way to a furious, desperate surge of energy. She hammered the knife against the steel until her knuckles bled. "Here!" Wyatt yelled from above, digging furiously with his hands and a small avalanche shovel. "The sound is coming from under this main joist." Pete joined him. Together, the 2 men attacked the debris. They cleared away a massive drift of snow, revealing a heavy slab of rusted roofing. Heaving together, they flipped it back. Beneath it lay a twisted steel I-beam, resting directly against a large, intact, wooden shipping crate. "Hey, are you in there?" Wyatt screamed, banging his gloved fist against the exposed plywood. From inside, a weak, hoarse voice drifted up, muffled, but undeniable. "Help, we got you. We're getting you out," Wyatt yelled back. The steel beam was incredibly heavy, wedged awkwardly against the crate's door panel. Pete ran back to the plow and returned with a heavy-duty hydraulic jack and a steel crowbar. Working with frantic precision, they positioned the jack beneath the I-beam. Slowly, agonizingly, the hydraulic pump lifted the immense weight off the wooden panel. "Pull the door," Pete grunted. Wyatt grabbed the edge of the plywood panel and wrenched it backward. Sunlight, blinding, harsh, and incredibly beautiful, flooded into the dark, foul-smelling interior of the crate. Wyatt shone his flashlight inside. Amidst a chaotic nest of torn cardboard, molded denim insulation, and a heavy canvas tarp, lay Anna. Her face was deathly pale. Her lips possessed a dangerous bluish tint, and her body was locked in a rigid, shivering curl. But her eyes were open, and they were looking right at him. "We got you, Anna," Wyatt said softly, reaching in and gently pulling her by the shoulders. The rescue was a blur. She remembered the blinding pain of the sunlight on her retinas, the agonizing prickle of blood trying to force its way back into her frozen extremities as she was carried to the heated cruiser, and the wail of the ambulance sirens that met them on Highway 85. At the Williston Medical Center, doctors worked frantically to raise her core temperature, which had plummeted to a dangerously low 92 degrees. She had suffered second-degree frostbite on 3 toes and her left ear, and she was severely dehydrated. But against all physiological odds, she was alive. 2 days later, still confined to a hospital bed, a nurse wheeled a chair into her room. Sitting in it, looking pale but remarkably stubborn, was her father, Arthur. He had survived his cardiac event, holding on just long enough to hear the news that his daughter had been pulled from the wreckage of Caldwell and Sons. Arthur reached out, his frail hand grasping her bandaged fingers. He looked at her, tears pooling in the deep wrinkles around his eyes. "You came," he whispered. "I told you I would," Anna replied, her voice still a raspy whisper. The doctors called it a miracle. Survival experts called it a textbook example of extreme thermal microclimate engineering. But Anna knew the truth. The heavy wooden crate had provided the walls. The discarded denim and bubble wrap had provided the insulation. But it was the desperate, unyielding will to see her father one last time that had fueled the fire inside the darkness. When the century storm descended to claim her, she had built her own sanctuary, refusing to let the cold have the final say. This story proves that the human will to survive, combined with quick thinking, can defy the most impossible odds. If you were captivated by Anna's incredible battle against the deep freeze, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a true story of resilience, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales of human endurance.